Good evening. It's time for Press Pass, still part of Decision 2017, our coverage of the electoral process, which continues, of course, up until the inauguration, when and if that happens. And, of course, the focus has changed right now. We're in a different phase. Let's look at what we can expect tonight. After the petition being filed, it's now to the courts, and there are some expectations from the journalists on what they should or should not do while covering the petitions in this particular room, the Supreme Court, in the next few days. That should sound familiar or even look familiar in case you are part of a WhatsApp group or even active on the digital platforms. Some of the fake news, and of course, we are telling you how to tell the fact from the fake, of course, with some of our guests here. And actually, let me introduce you to the very one who will be able to help us understand how to track what is fake and what is fact. Next to me, I have Philip Ogola. He is the digital humanitarian. In fact, if you search that on Twitter, that's what exactly you will find. A new media consultant, has been here before, and thank you for joining us again this evening. And Victor Bwire, he is the programs manager at the Media Council and has been a gwiji, as we would say in Swahili, for many years, and even is a lecturer to many in the profession of journalism. Next to him is Dorothy Kweyu. She has been a revised editor here at the Daily Nation and is now a freelance journalist and a consultant. And next to her is Clay Muganda, who is, I'm sure as you have followed him, a critique of media, but he works at the Standard as a writer and an editor, and has been a student of Dorothy, as he says, in the earlier days. It is good to have you with us, Clay Muganda. Now, let's just look at the focus today before I just get some preliminary answers to the election coverage so far. And yes, the following NASA's move to file a petition challenging presidential election results, the coverage now turns to that, exactly that, to the court. And there are several guidelines that are expected of journalists while covering the petitions. And this will include, and if we can run that footage, of course, of Friday when the petition was being filed. And yes, journalists are to arrive 15 minutes before proceedings begin at the Supreme Court. And we can expect some action as from Thursday onwards, at least from what the advocates are telling us. And journalists are not going to be allowed to distract the proceedings or the court sessions in any way, not doing any live links, definitely, or having any sounds that would distract the attention from the main action, that is the hearing and the proceedings of the court. The journalists are to use soft and cool lighting. Of course, it gets hot here. That's why you see my bald head shining. It definitely meant to give people in the court some room of comfort. And there's no use of undignified pictures from the courts, and court footage is not going to be used for political or commercial use, and the use of Supreme Court session images will be restricted, of course, for the very strict reason for the Supreme Court hearing of the presidential petitions. And now, let me just get to my panel as we get some quick reactions on what they feel has been the performance of the media. I'll start with you, Clay, and there's this particular piece that was on the Standard yesterday. And of course, it just goes to look at some of the feelings, sentiments of Kenyans as they followed the news. First of all, from an editor's perspective, without any bias, how do you think the media has done? The process still continues.
Oh, okay, fine. Here, I'm going to be, there are going to be some contradictions in whatever I'm going to say, in as much as where the media did well, I'll say they did well. Where we did badly, I'll admit that we did badly.
Right.
Okay, just from speaking to some of my professional colleagues, especially the guys who are there before me, they tell me that actually they would actually give the media maybe a 7 over 10. I think we probably did not do as much as we could have done. I don't think we did that a 7 over 10. I think we did poorly. And it's probably because we invested so much in equipment and in very little knowledge.
Okay. And are there instances that you can pull out of whichever station that you're watching, and what you think?
It's not about like maybe what I think what happens is, because I tend to refer to the opposition, and probably us. It was us, rather the private citizens, versus the government, because the government here is a case where I have a lot of faith in the government. That's supposed to do the right thing. It is supposed to protect us. We are supposed to look up to the government. So when here is a case where the government does something wrong, I mean, it's not that I'm criticizing the government, but I'm just awake to the fact that it is supposed to do better than that. So I think we did fall into the trap of the government or the people who have, or the establishment, and in the process, we should change ourselves. So here's a case where we fell into the script of the government or of the establishment. There was a lot of gaslighting, whataboutism. Whichever narrative the government was trying to sell to us, we actually swallowed it hook, line, and sinker.
Were there any narratives from the opposition, in your view?
I would not want to blame the opposition because I treat them as private citizens. I treat them as private citizens because they don't have monopoly of power. The person who has the authority here is the government. If actually we are told, like, you cannot cover IEBC, you cannot air IEBC results, I would not blame the opposition, because the opposition has no CS for information. This information came from the establishment.
All right.
And here's a case where we're being told that you cannot cover this. Then all of a sudden we're told we make we make soft noises. Then he comes around and tells us, okay, fine, now you can cover it. So we tend to think like, oh, we've actually made noise and the establishment has given in to our demands. But I tend to think that actually this was just a part of the script. We were not well prepared for the kind of onslaught that actually that's why I call it gaslighting, the kind of propaganda or the kind of information, the kind of modern tools that the government was using. We are not ready for that.
You still haven't answered whether there, in your view, there was any propaganda or narratives being shaped from the other side, whichever side. But I'll give Dorothy an opportunity here, just a quick reaction in terms of what he said, Clay Muganda said, and what you have picked following the election coverage. And you definitely even would write to me even as we were in the heat of the moment during the coverage.
Thank you, Mark. I think I would go a lot with what Clay is saying, and this is not because it is fashionable to bash us as the media. It's because we are supposed to be critical of ourselves, because if we are not, then nobody else will. So
where would you say we failed? I just want to get quick reactions as we start.
I think that one of the biggest shortcomings on us was sourcing, and this is an issue that we have discussed in this forum before. There is a serious shortcoming when it comes to sourcing, in the sense that you find so much of insider sources, internal rebellion, and you're not being told, you know, it is good to say insider sources, but at least give me one, you know, so that it is easier to say, okay, so and so is the anchor on whom my story is based. But you cannot build a whole story on insider sources. And I'll give you an example. There is the story that appeared just around the time that NASA finally agreed to go to court, and it says NASA gives in to pressure over election petition cause.
Yeah, and I'm actually looking at that, if my director would be able to patch in the rest as we look at the same.
Yes.
This was on the Daily Nation.
When you read that story, the only source that is mentioned is Mariette Shark, this EU person. And then, when they mention the NASA principles, of course those are principles, but they are not even saying that they said what is coming out. It is insider sources, it's NASA insider, it is the source, it is sources inside the 6-hour meeting. And for me it gets to be very scary, because one of the principles of even quoting, even if you must protect your sources, you know, we used to be told that at least if you have a statement and you are told this is off the record, go and get somebody who can authenticate it. That seems to be not coming out.
But one of the principles as well is protecting your sources, especially if they would feel they don't want to be, you know, put out in the light as to being an informant. Isn't that the case?
Yes, that is why once you have been told, you know, this is off the record, you know, then you say, okay, whom can I talk to? And then Clay will tell me, actually, if you talk to so-and-so, he'll tell you. And it is somebody who is strong enough,
right,
or who is credible enough to say, yes, this was discussed, you know. But to build a whole story on insider sources and so on, for me, it's not acceptable.
All right. And this was a story by Samuel Wino and Ibrahim Oruko on the Daily Nation. In a piece that you wrote, Bona Victor, this was on Sunday Nation. One of the paras here, you say, and you respond, and it's in response to one of the concerns that were raised in Clay's article. Those who are judging the media merely on the account that they did not release the election results after the tallying as being a failure are not fair. There are legal and logistical challenges that made this impossible and not professional inability. Explain this, especially on the numbers.
Thank you, Mark. One of the challenges we are having in media today is not individual failures. It's purely a structural, institutional challenges that some of these people are facing. But we tend to pick out the journalists and say the shortcomings in the media we are seeing today is purely individual journalists. And that's how I looked at that in terms of raising. Because when Dorothy raises the issue of unnamed sources, for example, you look at our media houses where journalists are assigned stories by virtue of their tribe and association to parties. So that who covers NASA for Nation, for example, Standard, or who covers Jubilee for, you already start seeing those tribal inclination, and that's why those tendencies of insider sources, because we have now moved, even institutionalized the issue of bedded journalists, that the journalists are now part of this party and this party, so that when they even say insider sources, editors rarely even ask them according to who, because we build,
like, okay, Victor is
yes,
the
person, Jubilee person, and we seem to have institutionalized this, and you obviously start seeing that some of the journalists are more trusted to be sourced than even the editors, so that the editors rarely even ask those hard questions that you are raising. So that is an institutional problem, right, that I'm seeing.
What some would say, or would argue, comparing this to other democracies where there are those who cover Republicans and those who cover the Democrats, and they're specially allocated that task, especially during campaigns, they follow and pursue. Are you saying we're not mature enough to be able to get to that level?
It's a professional association of understanding. It's not a tribal. Look at our headlines and who writes from which party. It's purely, you would see, it's so and so. You have told me who have written that story on NASA. Who are they? You can obviously see the perceived political orientation. So that then we are institutionalizing this thinking that Victor Bwire must write from this particular party. Once we do that, then we are falling into a very big trap. That's one of the challenges I'm saying. The other challenge is, like I mentioned, in terms of institutional failures, is you send a journalist, for example, Nation had 290, or Standard had 290 correspondents for the constituencies. But remember, in one constituency, we had almost how many polling centers? Like in one of Mombasa had 132. You have a journalist who visited only 3. But this guy is expected to file almost like what IBC is doing, so that then media is Nation is supposed to tally using that one person who could not even, and when you talk to them, one, transport challenges, they could not even move from one center to the other, there are safety challenges and all those related. Remember, in most of these people were employed, just most of the short-term employees came on board a week to election, not even the the traditional journalists we had. So they had all those challenges that they could not even give the information that we needed.
Right.
So to me, I'm looking at an institutional problem, not an individual, that the journalists are unable to write or do some of these things that we, but the architecture and the environment in which, what is the demand, for example, in some of our media houses, in terms of the information they require from their journalists. What are the standards? If you are giving me a story, I mean, what are the minimums, so that as an editor, then I use this story.
Right.
So those are challenges that I see that we are trying to throw to journalists. What is the role of editors? Because you will see in our discussion, when we are doing this massive, for example, trainings and how many editors were trained? How many sub-editors and program controllers or video editors were trained in some of these things, so that they have the same knowledge? So we have journalists who are overtrained, the writers and the correspondents, but we have sub-editors, program controllers, producers, who have no knowledge on some of these things we are talking about.
All right.
So that's why I'm talking about an institutional problem.
Okay. Before Dorothy jumps in to interject, to probably add to a point that you've made there, I see she wants to speak. Philip Ogola, you specialize in, as a digital humanitarian, you call yourself, you specialize on debunking what is misinformation out there in the digital, in the blogosphere or in the digital world. And one of the things pointed out in Clay's article from yesterday, and he says, you know, their collective grasp was that is the people in the audience. Local journalists were not reporting what innocent Kenyans were going through at the hands of the police, who are supposed to uphold the law, and were instead airing children's shows. And the accusation that the media are in bed with the government did not start with the 2017 elections, but has been the narrative from 2013, when journalists were invited to State House for breakfast. Before we get to the breakfast, that popular breakfast that is always spoken of, that issue of media not showing what Kenyans were going through, but other Kenyans were getting supposedly what people were going through social media. In most of the cases, what did you encounter?
I think the media did a good work during the elections, but they dropped the ball after the poll tallying. Because during the elections, you are getting real-time updates in terms of the numbers coming in, and even updates from far-flung areas on how the voting is actually going on. But after the tallying, there were actually pockets of violence around the country. So during those violence, we didn't see any updates of what's actually going on the ground. And the sad bit was, you know, when there's a vacuum, when media not reporting what's going on, propaganda filled that vacuum.
Yes.
So there's a lot of misinformation on the riots, on the protests, on the raping, which was quite a lie. And it was quite sad that when you flip the TV, you're actually watching cartoons, you're watching celebrations here and there. And during that time, I was actually volunteering for the Red Cross. So news came in that there are riots in Madare, in Kibera, and here. Red Cross team went on a wild goose chase, looking for those injuries. There's nothing. Turning on TV, there's nothing. So I find that during that period, media actually failed to actually inform Kenyans on possible hotspots or even issue alerts that avoid this road here and there. So social media actually filled in that gap.
With information or misinformation?
With misinformation.
All right.
Which was quite false.
Right, and I'd want you to get to that point of how we can separate what is fact and what is fake. Dorothy, as Victor was talking, you had a point to interject.
I think Victor made a very important point, that our problem is not really an individual problem. It is actually an institutional problem. And I would want to agree with that, because it all starts with the briefing that the reporter is being given before he steps out of the newsroom. And when he comes back, the debriefing that is being done. But if you let the reporters loose, you know, that they're just doing things on their own, and you are under so much pressure, you know, and I know that the newspaper has completely grown from for instance, the newspaper has completely grown from the days when we joined the nation. It was like 24 pages. Now we are talking of 60, 72 pages. That's a lot to cover in a day.
Yes.
So that creates room for a lot of lapses, so that whatever somebody has written is taken for gospel truth. And even when he comes, there's no time to debrief them. It's that, when are we having that story? and somebody is going to give whatever he gives, and the sub, who is under a lot of pressure, is going to push it on to the revise, and the revise to the production, and so on. So the whole system actually collapses.
Right. Clay, I don't know if you want...
I think I'll agree with the case of the poor briefing or the system collapsing, as we used to call it DM, as DM says. What is happening is, like, I remember case in point when it comes to briefing, when NTV had a reporter in Kibera live, and I had to tweet that I think the NTV reporter in Kibera needs to go back to the office for briefing, because what I was listening to and what I was seeing on TV, whatever he was saying, he was totally out of depth. He actually, he had, you call it dead air. He didn't want to have dead air. So he had to keep on talking. But whatever he was saying actually did not make sense at all. And when I tweeted that, some people also said, like, oh, actually, I thought I was alone. But you see, for me, I tweet from the side of a journalist, not just to criticize, but I look at it and I see, like, okay, fine, because I don't believe in this thing that there's a TV journalist and there's a print journalist. You're a journalist, you're a journalist.
Journalism.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so I don't believe in this thing. So for me, I was looking at it as a journalist, and I was feeling like, I think this guy probably was not well briefed, or probably it was the case of, like, oh, there are riots in Kibera or something is happening in Kibera. Who's around? You go. That pressure. Then this pressure also when it comes to writing stories, and I tell you, we get so many badly written stories, and everybody is under pressure. It's not like those days when actually you would spend maybe an hour going through a story, calling the writer back and asking, can you clarify this, before the story probably moved from the sub-editor to the revise editor. Nowadays, the person files the story and goes to another story. And at the same time, even the story that even if you file under pressure, you're supposed to do something. I mean, this is something I used to tell my editors, is that I'm going to give you a reader-ready story. I'm going to give you a story that actually, if you're under pressure, you can actually put it on, you can actually publish it without worrying. But nowadays, the kind of stories that we get from the field, sometimes you even wonder, do I go ahead with this story? Because everything based on what you know is totally out of tune.
All right. And
so I think, yes, the institution, the media as the institution, I think we are failing.
All right.
Either it is our training, or we've actually just decided, like, okay, fine, what's my job? My job is to write a story. And then, just a minute, and then there's this thing about when we used to be in the newsroom those days, if we wrote a story and I gave the story to DM, she would actually make all those corrections, and she would compel me to read what I wrote and what is published. But that one never happens nowadays. I meet very many journalists, actually, let me call them print journalists, and I probably tell them, like, oh, there was something on TV, I think probably you can follow it up and do a story. And then you tell me, like, I don't watch TV. And I'm wondering, like, oh, you're a journalist, you don't watch TV. You've not been even in the newsroom for 1 week, and you're already telling me that you don't watch TV. So what is, I mean, I watch TV because I am a journalist, because that is what I do.
To get informed.
Yes.
Right. And something here, Gadara tweets, and he was here last week. 2 weeks after the election, no Kenyan media has released an independent tally of results. He sees this as a problem. Victor, as programs manager from the Media Council, you interacted a lot with the stakeholders, and there was that media briefing, or at least statement from the Minister of ICT, and he said that no media house should or would be allowed to air or broadcast any independent numbers. Was this, what cowed the media houses? Was there a secret rule not to have any independent numbers? Because that's what people are on. We failed Kenyans by not giving them numbers that we got from our various correspondents.
I think even in addition to working at the Media Council, luckily I've also worked under them, and they trained me. I started my first article at Irish. But what I was sharing that I've seen is that the media in Kenya is under capture. It's not necessarily state capture, but we are under capture for a lot of reasons: technological, economic reasons, and institutional capture. And for that reason, media wants to be gentle I mean, we are told this, and look at even the investors. Who are the investors? I mean, for example, I saw the chairman of Nation Media Group, for example, who is also the chairman of eminent persons in Kenya who are preaching for peace. So once that has been done, how do you expect Nation Media journalists to cover such things? So you start seeing a situation where, for example, somebody was raising the issue of those results. What were the previous pronouncements and statements to media towards releasing results? The environment was, do that, we'll close you down. Communication Authority of Kenya releases guidelines, Media Council releases guidelines, National Cohesion releases guidelines. The court has just released, there were too many guidelines for media to observe to a level where everybody has guidelines for media on, so media is operating in a very prescriptive environment where everybody has given rules and regulations.
Were there any guidelines from the Media Council specific to the numbers, the tallying?
I mean, if you look at the guidelines that were released by the media on election guidelines, it was purely that election results can only be released by the Electoral Management Board, which is IBC. If you look at the regulations from CAA, I mean, all those rules, almost all of them were demanding that election guidelines, results must only be released by IBC.
So if those were the rules, did media fail then?
That's what I was saying. That's what I was saying. One, did the media even have the results to release? Because you must ask yourself, if the 290, for example, reporters that Nation sent out, did they all of them get the results that Nation would then tally and release? Because that's some of the things I was raising. That unlike IBC that had returning officers and presiding officers in all centers, media did not have. So they depended in areas where at night the counting, something happened. Some of those journalists could not even access. In some areas where people became rude and rough, like in Isiolo, I have clips from Lamu, where even journalists were thrown out there. I mean, in Luanda constituency, where the returning officer says, throw out these journalists, and they're out. So if Nation was depending, for example, on those journalists to send them the tallies, what did the Nation release? So there was also a vacuum of information on what media to release. So it's not that they have information they have refused to release, but they are also struggling with the issue of getting that information to release complete information.
Okay. Let me give Philip first an opportunity to respond to this, because in this regard as well, then there are other figures that come up on social media and you can't quite, and I'll get to that point where you'll show us how someone can track or go back to see what is fake and what is fact. Yes, on this particular issue.
First, I would just like also to compliment what Bwire has said. I think the media as an institution lack technical expertise and the human power to actually have journalists who have the expertise to tell stories in a more human way. Like, for example, during the IBC, we didn't have journalists who can actually give us the tech side of what the NASA team was saying. Because it was one side NASA saying this, but getting it from the media to break it down to us.
You talk about the hacking claims and what have you.
Just getting a journalist who actually understand the tech side of that actually came out very strong. That our media actually lack that, and even in terms of actually verifying information online, I don't think our media have actually invested to actually gather and actually mine data and even geolocate and get pulse of what's actually being said, because they also disconnect on what's being aired and what's viral online.
Okay, well, what are we saying then, Victor, with the rules and the guidelines that were out, especially from Media Council, which is what we follow in many cases, or try to, ideally, then even if we had the numbers out, and even if we told Kenyans that we have many correspondents at different polling stations or tallying centers, then we had no place or opportunity to give independent numbers whatsoever.
You see, what is gradually happening is that media is a place where a lot of gentle people have invested in. And gradually, these are people who are looking at their profits. If you look at who invests in media, it's those people who want power and profits. So do they want to risk any law of closure? Do they want to have any tension with anybody? They want to play gentle. So that's why I'm talking about an institutional problem, that all these things are bringing back, and journalists are asking themselves within the various cycles, WhatsApp group and what, are we as a profession really playing the role we ought to play, or have we become too gentle and listened to investors more than our journalistic calling?
All right. Dorothy, real quick before we take a break, and Claire, real quick.
Mark, I'm afraid that you are driving at us into a reasoning cul-de-sac. That you are actually driving us into a tunnel from which we cannot reason. The reason being that I think one of the cardinal rules of journalism or publishing as such is publish and be damned, you know. So you shouldn't reach a point where you are so intimidated that because they said this, therefore. So why did they invest in all those journalists, you know? Why? Mm-hmm. And it all goes back to 2008 when I was still here actually, and we had that scandalous situation where we had a tallying center that never tallied anything. It actually collapsed, you know. And
was it hacked?
Do I know?
Okay, all right. I mean, you said you were here. You said you were here. You said you were here. Yes.
People get so scared.
So we get into a situation where, you know, we give so much hope. Everybody was excited that Nation is going to have 290 reporters. And at the end of the day, you know, it is a situation where an elephant goes into labor and produces a fly. You know, it's ridiculous.
Oh, my word. Real quick, Clay, we have below a minute
about what
on this issue.
Say that the media is under capture. I mean, especially, I mean, like, there's a economic capture and stuff like that. Yes, that's why I don't want to go so much into this tallying business that where are the media's results, because I tend to believe that actually we could not have had everybody, I mean, people at every polling station or at every constituency. This is basically because of the economy. Probably some economies can afford that and probably can afford to have people who are credible enough, probably to hire them just for that time. Like, okay, fine, we're paying you this much per hour, be at this polling station for 6 hours and give us these results. They can do that. I think here the economy does not allow us probably to do that. In this economy, there's so many things that the media cannot do because of the economy of the country generally. But when it comes to this other capture where you're saying like this bureaucratic, where CA was giving all these guidelines and CS and all that, I think this other bureaucratic capture, or can I call it, I don't know whether state capture, I think we have allowed these people to kick us around. The media, the Kenyan media, have allowed to be kicked around, have allowed CA and these government bodies and these government entities to kick us around. In 2007, 2008, when they did say like, okay, fine, you cannot do live coverage, I remember talking to one of the senior editors here in TV, and I asked him, why can't we give these guys a blackout? Why can't we give the government a blackout, or whoever it is a blackout? And he told me, no, we can't do that because they're the people who give us news. It depends. I think it's because of where I trained. Right. Where I did my training. Yes, where I did my training. I mean, you can't joke around with journalists. A journalist is a very important person. Here, a journalist is not an important person. And why is it like that? Because we have allowed them to kick us around. We have refused to stand up for our rights.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, and we'll get back to this conversation, how we can turn this. But Philip, you probably take this desk in the next part, because I want you to illustrate some of the things that we need to be able to do when we are telling apart what is real and what is fake in the information that is being passed on in various social media platforms and even making its way to mainstream. Stay with Press Pass. Back in a bit. Welcome back to Press Pass. The conversation definitely continues here, and thank you for the feedback that you are giving as you follow the conversation. And just to read a few here, Maurice Otieno says, carrots were the government-sponsored PDU ads and the stick threat of being shut down. Maurice Otieno, you say, as you follow this conversation, Gadara, again, there really can be no excuse for media not reporting the final numbers, results as announced by returning officers at constituency tallying centers. And George Morara says, we, the Kenya media, have allowed state bureaucrats and other state functionaries to kick us around, actually quoting what Clay Muganda is saying. And Anthony Ngayo says, we are back to having KBC, only in different outfits, full of regime rhetoric, but lack substantive reporting. Even framing of news is biased. And game changer, Jeffy Chai says, politicians are stakeholders in these media houses. They can't bite the hand that feeds them. Elvis Jono says, so Kenya's economy cannot allow a media house to employ 290 journalists for a short election stint. And whatever you put there is a show of some shock, but of course just some comedy there. Vitalis Kimutai says, coverage of post-election police brutality against citizens is another serious matter that exposed the media's soft underbelly. I'll start with, as I talk to you, Victor, from Media Council's perspective, was there, in your observation, covering up of elections, violence, or the brutality of police as reported in some sections of the country? And was this in line with the gospel of peace?
Thank you. I mean, while a number of people have raised the issue of media, again, not showing incidents of violence, but while it's a professional challenge and a failure if that happened where people sat on the stories, but me, more importantly also, I'm looking at the environment that had been created around the issue of violence-related, election-related violence. It's just the same topic like what we have been telling media to report around issues of extremism or terrorist attacks or something. What has been the general mood? I mean, that has already prevailed. And look at the environment that had been created just before election, the trainings, the meetings, and were all centered around. So to me, like I repeated, is that we must, like you mentioned, start revisiting is that this capture, what does media do? I mean, when some of these laws were being passed, some of this administrative whatever, we were there watching, and none of us raised anything. Then all of a sudden we become captive of the same laws and regulations that were being passed, and some of our editors were appending their signatures and saying these are the rules that will guide us. So at what level do we then start asking ourselves, the Editors Guild, the AMWIC, the KUJs, the other players, that there's something happening with the institution, the journalism institution, that we need to arrest. That if we are going to do what we are doing now, then we are purely becoming, I would not say pure, but we are just becoming pipelines. We are just being there to be used.
Answer this. What Anne Mulehi says or observes. She says the media had previously been criticized for inciting inciting violence, and this time they were more reserved in their coverage. Do you feel this is what informed?
She was one of she is a journalist and one of the trainers somewhere, I can remember that name. And these are the people we are pumping in information of how to be conflict sensitive when you are reporting, and everybody was all over telling them you must be, I mean, sometimes we ask if we are doing the evaluation of the trainings we are doing in terms of the topic gender sensitive reporting, conflict sensitive reporting. If people then who are conflict sensitive in their reporting, do we say they followed the rules that we gave them, or do we say that they have? So to me, we start looking at that level, that where do we say we succeeded in the interventions we were doing, or where do we say that? So to me, that's where the challenge is, that at what level are we interacting with the processes around helping journalists be the reporters that we want them to be.
Clay, you mentioned 2007, 2008, and you were here.
Yeah.
And that's when actually there was the accusation of media fanning the flames of violence. Do you agree in instances where live pictures were shown of 1 or 2 people being killed and that being replicated, the copycat effect, as some would call it, being replicated in other areas where people now have revenge attacks? Was that, in your view, a true assessment of what would happen if media were to show some of these violent scenes?
I think what happens in this country is that media is a very easy scapegoat. It's the easiest scapegoat that actually everybody runs to. I don't think, and I still believe, during the violence itself of 2007, 2008, and this year I don't want to call it post-election violence because there was no post-election violence, there's post-election police brutality. That is what happened this time. In 2007, 2008, there was a build-up to all this. It did not start, it was not a spontaneous thing as people tend to think. I mean, the kind of campaigns that were being done, there was a lot of hatred. it was actually going to happen either one way or the other. That kind
whether
of
it was
violence,
covered and shown or not.
no, whether it was covered and shown or not. By the time people were being burnt in a church in Eldoret, the media did nothing to actually make some people be killed in Naivasha. It was not because the media showed the images in Eldoret, that's why there were revenge attacks in Naivasha. And actually, when you talk to some of these people, what actually the media aired was not even a quarter of what actually happened. We aired very little. So I think this idea of saying that the media fund the 2007-2008 post-election violence, I think it's a lie. It's a myth. And it's a myth that is gaining traction, and people tend to believe it. We've been bombarded with it so much as the media that actually now we don't tread carefully, but we are walking on eggshells. Anytime it comes like election time,
yes,
we tend to start preaching the peace ourselves. Because this thing, we were accused. We could defend ourselves that
Well,
time.
someone asks, are you a patriot first or are you a professional first?
What is a patriot?
You tell me, what are you, patriot first or a professional
I mean,
first?
a patriot does not mean lying, telling lies just to cover up for your country.
Professionals are better patriots.
Wait,
Yeah,
Dorothy,
think,
and then Philip.
Clay has raised a very important point. And I personally think that we should never be caught in a situation where we are so intimidated as to forget our primary duty, which is speaking truth to power. If, for instance, like happened recently, 2 children have been killed, and a person as respectable as C.S. Fred Matiang'i says nobody has been killed, that is scandalous,
And isn't that story told? Hasn't it been told?
Finally, but for him to have spun that narrative, and for us to be expected to buy into it, that is where we would completely fail. And we must reject a situation where we are being led by the nose and talking what authorities want us to talk rather than going to where the problem is and revealing. I like the way that the 2 stories of the 2 little girls, the infant
Baby Pendo and the Stephen.
Yes. I like the way that we eventually got to know the truth. But if we were to be intimidated and say, CS has said,
Nobody died.
can you imagine? Can you just imagine how it would be judged?